Before the reign of giants, the world fell silent. 252 million years ago, the planet experienced a systematic failure. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm. It was a slow, agonizing execution. 96% of all life in the sea, gone. 70% of all vertebrates on land, erased. 83% of all insect species, vanished. This was not just an extinction. It was a near-total sterilization of the biosphere. The evidence points not to an impact from the heavens, but to a wound that opened from within the Earth itself. In the heart of the supercontinent Pangaea, in a region we now call Siberia, the ground split open. For millennia, it bled fire. Lava flows, relentless and suffocating, buried a territory larger than modern Australia under kilometers of molten rock. A geological scar known today as the Siberian Traps. The eruptions were merely the trigger. The kill mechanism was far more insidious. Trillions of tons of carbon and sulfur choked the sky, trapping heat until the planet began to cook. The oceans, once teeming with complexity, turned acidic and warm. The intricate architecture of the reefs dissolved into sludge. The base of the global food chain disintegrated. First in the water, then on the land. A slow, cascading collapse of an entire world order. Other factors may have accelerated the process. Methane, frozen in the seabed, could have thawed and erupted, intensifying the warming. Rogue bacterial blooms might have poisoned the remaining water. The truth is a tapestry of interlocking catastrophes, each one amplifying the other, pushing the system past its breaking point. The oceans became graveyards, the land a desolate waste under a hazy, unforgiving sun. This was the Great Dying. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, a boundary line in the deep history of our world, drawn in ash and bone. Yet life did not entirely cease. In the toxic air and poisoned seas, a few clung on. Not the largest, not the strongest, but the most resilient. The creatures that survived this planetary furnace inherited a world emptied of its masters, a world devoid of competition. The extinction was not an ending. It was a violent clearing of the board, a biological vacuum. And into that silence, something new was about to crawl. The question is not simply what survived. The question is what kind of world is born when the rules of life are rewritten by fire and stone. A world gasping for breath. The air itself is thin, an alien mixture that would leave a human in a state of perpetual exhaustion. Scientists estimate the atmosphere held a mere 13% oxygen, a stark, suffocating contrast to the 21% that fuels our world today. This was not a planet thriving. It was a planet in recovery, scarred by a cataclysm that had wiped the slate almost clean. And in this thin, harsh air, the survivors took their first tentative steps into a new era. Among them were the archosaurs, a group of reptiles whose descendants would one day command the skies, the rivers, and the land itself. The pterosaurs, the crocodiles, and the creatures that would come to define an age, the dinosaurs. To understand their rise, we must first understand the world they inherited. The very ground beneath their feet would be unrecognizable. No Europe, no Asia, no Americas. Only a single colossal landmass, a titan of rock and sand known as Pangaea. It was a world without the familiar tapestry of continents, surrounded by the endless, solitary ocean of Panthalassa. This monolithic geography created a climate of extremes. With no vast oceans to moderate its temper, the heart of Pangaea was a furnace. An immense, scorched desert stretched across its interior, a landscape of unforgiving heat and profound dryness. Even the great ocean was sick. As global temperatures soared, its circulation faltered. The deep waters, once teeming with life, became stagnant, oxygen-starved tombs. Anoxia, the absence of life-giver that was their home, became their executioner. They simply suffocated. The flora, too, was a ghost of what came before and what was yet to come. There were no flowers to color this landscape. The earth was cloaked in a stoic green and brown, ancient conifers, resilient cycads, and sprawling ferns clinging to the margins of the great desert. In the waters, only the most primitive algae fought for a foothold. And yet, life endured. While some lineages vanished into extinction, others adapted, seizing the opportunity born from desolation. The archosaurs were not yet the giants of legend. They were relatively small, built for a brutal world. Their critical advantage was a revolution in anatomy. Legs positioned not splayed out to the sides, but directly beneath the body. This seemingly simple change granted them a new level of stability, speed, and efficiency. In a world where every drop of water, every patch of shade, every scrap of food was a battle, efficiency was the ultimate currency of survival. They were not alone. Another group, the therapsids, walked a different evolutionary path. Things with the first hints of fur, with the radical biological idea of generating their own internal heat. Their evolution ran in parallel to the archosaurs, a quiet story unfolding in the shadows. This was a world of pioneers, a hot, desolate planet, sparsely populated and starved of oxygen. But it was in this crucible that the future was forged. The story of the dinosaurs' dominion is not one of inherent superiority. It is a story of circumstance. They did not conquer a thriving planet. They inherited a broken one. They were the ultimate survivors, perfectly positioned to capitalize on the void left by a global crisis. As the dust of the old world settled, a new age dawned. The Triassic period. This was the beginning of a vast chapter in Earth's history, the Mesozoic era. The name itself, from the Greek mesos for middle and zoe for life, signals a grand transition, the age of middle life. An epoch spanning roughly 186 million years, divided into three iconic acts: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. The planet that had nearly suffocated, the world born of heat and emptiness, was now the stage. A stage set for the rise of titans. In the deep time between worlds, at the very suture of catastrophe and rebirth, the first whispers of their name were heard. It began 252 million years ago. The great silence had fallen, the air still thick with the ash of a planet scoured to the bone by an extinction so profound it nearly ended the story of life itself. This new chapter, the Triassic, would unfold across 50 million years of recovery. Its name, a testament left by 19th-century geologists, was written in three stark lines of stone: a foundation of red sand, a heart of limestone, and a final, mournful layer of clay. A scar and a prophecy etched into the crust of the earth. This was a liminal age, a corridor between the world of ancient, sprawling reptiles and the coming empire of giants. Pangaea, the planet's single, lonely continent, baked under a relentless sun. It was a furnace of a world, arid and severe, where forests were rare and hardy, and the vast, shallow oceans gasped for breath, starved of oxygen. The air itself was thin, a ghost's whisper of what it once was, and what it would one day become. But life is patient. Over the span of eons, as the planet's wounded systems slowly healed, the vital breath of oxygen began to seep back into the atmosphere. This slow, invisible infusion would fuel the fires of a biological revolution. And into this crucible of fire and dust, a new idea took form. A group of reptiles known as the Archosaurs. They were not a single species, but an entire architectural blueprint for survival and dominance. From this single explosive origin would eventually spring the crocodiles, the pterosaurs, and the titans who would inherit the Earth, the dinosaurs. The early archosaurs were unassuming. Some were no larger than a dog, the greatest of them the size of a small ostrich. They moved with a startling new agility, rising up on their hind legs, quick and nimble in a world of slow, lumbering beasts. Their secret was a revolution in anatomy. Where other reptiles sprawled, their legs splayed out to the sides in an ancient and inefficient push-up, the archosaurs possessed a profound innovation. Their limbs were positioned directly beneath the body. This simple shift in geometry was the key. It granted them a terrible grace, an efficiency of motion that left the old world struggling in the dust, allowing them to conserve energy, to run faster, to strike with a balance and precision previously unknown. They were a living, breathing, technological leap. And from this vibrant, violent lineage, one branch blake. The first true dinosaurs, according to the stone scriptures of the fossil record, stepped onto the world stage around 240 million years ago. One of the very first was a creature named Eoraptor, the dawn plunderer. Its delicate skeleton, unearthed from the patient earth of Argentina, tells a story of small beginnings. A creature barely a meter long, weighing less than 10 kilograms. A flicker of life, quick on two legs, with a mouth full of sharp teeth and a palate that knew the taste of lizards, the flesh of other small vertebrates, and the green shoots of resilient plants. Another early protagonist, also found in the cradle of South America, was Herrerasaurus. It was a larger shadow, stretching 3 meters from snout to tail. An active predator, a hunter whose form was a more definitive statement, a glimpse of the scale of things to come. These were the pioneers. They did not dominate their world. They did not shake the ground with their footfalls. They were insurgents, opportunists, seizing the niches of small and medium-sized predators in ecosystems already crowded with formidable players. For in the Triassic, the dinosaurs were not yet the masters of this broken kingdom. They were merely candidates for the throne, and the competition was fierce. They faced the crocodilomorphs, the ancient and terrifyingly diverse relatives of modern crocodiles. Many of these were not river dwellers, but swift, terrestrial predators, armored brutes who ruled the land with brutal efficiency. And then there were the therapsids, the last embers of a different thing in the shadow of these new, dynamic assassins. The first dinosaurs were not a roar that shook the heavens. Not yet. They were a single footprint pressed into the damp red earth beside a drying riverbed. A question mark left for geology to answer. A silent promise of a dynasty, waiting for the world to turn, for the rains to fall, and for the future to finally begin. Before the age of giants, there was an age of ghosts, a world of creatures that were not quite reptile and not yet mammal. A failed dynasty whose whispers still echo in our own DNA. They were the therapsids. On a planet still recovering from a near-total extinction, they were a blueprint for the future. Some were hunters, others grazers. But in their blood, something new was stirring. The capacity to generate their own heat. On their snouts, the first sensitive whiskers, mapping a world in darkness. In their burrows, a radical new behavior, the protection of their young. They were a dress rehearsal for us. Consider a creature named Oligokyphus. It moved through the late Triassic undergrowth, no more than half a meter long, with the fluid, predatory grace of a weasel. Its body was live, covered in a coat of insulating fur. It was warm-blooded in a cold-blooded world. And evidence suggests it did something that would define the next 200 million years of evolution. It may have fed its young with milk, a secret passed down, not in genes alone, but in the chemistry of care. While this quiet revolution was happening on land, another was unfolding in the silence of the oceans. The seas had been scoured clean by the last great dying. They were empty canvases. Into this void swam the ichthyosaurs. Marine reptiles, yes, but their bodies were a startling premonition. Streamlined, powerful, with a dorsal fin and a vertical tail. Nature was sketching the same lethal shape twice, separated by an eon. They were the dolphins of their day. One of the first titans of this new marine order was Symbospondylus. It patrolled the oceans between 240 and 210 million years ago. 10 meters of serpentine musthing, more ancient. Its entire body undulated lance. Rudders on a living torpedo, hunting the first waves of new fish. The oceans were still thin, still poor. The true monsters, the plesiosaurs, the mosasaurs, were still just a distant nightmare. Back on the surface, the world itself was beginning to break. The supercontinent, Pangaea, was groaning under its own weight. The crust fractured, rifts opened, bleeding magma. As the land masses tore apart, new oceans were born between them. The climate, once brutally arid at the continent's heart, was transformed. The world's single vast lung began to heave. Rains came that had not fallen for millennia. With the rain came plants. With the plants came new ecosystems, more food, more shelter, more opportunities. The stage was being set for a new act. But first, the old cast had to be removed. Around 201 million years ago, a quiet verdict was passed. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction event. It was not a sudden cataclysm of fire and rock. It was a silent, creeping purge. The competitors to the dinosaurs were systematically erased. The heavily armored crocodile morphs that ruled the rivers. The giant, lurking amphibians. And almost every remaining branch of the therapsids, our own distant, warm-blooded kin. Their experiment was over. Someone dies. Someone else gets a chance. This time, the beneficiaries were the dinosaurs. Why they survived is a question that haunts paleontology. Was their respiratory system more efficient in an atmosphere of changing gases? Was their metabolism, their mobility, simply better suited to the chaos? Or was it just blind, statistical luck? A roll of the cosmic dice that landed in their favor? We don't know. We only know what happened next. The extinction left a void. Dozens of ecological niches suddenly vacant. Predators that had shaped life for millions of years were gone. Competitors for food, for territory, for sunlight vanished. A new race began, and the dinosaurs, small, agile, and relentlessly adaptable, were the ones who exploded out of the starting blocks. The Jurassic period was not born. It was unleashed. The time of giants, of earth-shaking footsteps and teeth the size of daggers, was about to begin. But it all started here, in the Triassic shadows, with small, almost unseen creatures, quietly and persistently pushing forward, while the rest of the world lost its way. The system reset itself. The board was wiped clean, and in the silence, a new dynasty took the throne. But it raises a chilling, fundamental question about the nature of life on this planet. Every mass extinction is a lottery. How many other futures were written, then erased, by a planet that plays no favorites? 56 million years. A stretch of time so offensively vast, it mocks our entire concept of history. It's more than enough time for a planet to get bored and completely redecorate. And that's precisely what Earth did during the Jurassic period. The world's one and only supercontinent, Pangaea, a colossal landmass of cosmic indifference, finally decided it had seen enough of itself. It began to crack, to splinter, the world's slowest, most dramatic breakup. First, it fractured into two uninspired chunks, Laurasia to the north, Gondwana lethargy. These were the prototypes, the rough drafts of the continents we now call home. This continental divorce wasn't just a matter for geologists. It was a declaration of war on biological conformity. As the landmasses drifted, they created barriers, new oceans, impassable mountain ranges, and wildly different climate zones emerged. Each new island continent became a separate, isolated laboratory, a petri dish where evolution could throw its most unhinged ideas at the wall to see what stuck. Life, no longer homogenized, began to specialize, to mutate, to get weird. The suffocating global sauna. The dry deserts gave way to damp, steaming tropics. A relentless humidity settled over everything. Lush, wet forests of ferns, cycads, and primitive conifers exploded across the land, fueled by a warm, stable climate that had no time for such trivialities as seasons or ice caps. The poles were green. The whole planet was a greenhouse. This endless planetary buffet of vegetation had a predictable side effect. With an infinite food supply, the things that ate the food got big. Stupidly, gloriously, impossibly big. This was the era of the sauropods, the long-necked titans that became the poster children for prehistoric, exculously long neck at one end, a ridiculously long tail at the other. We know them by their names. Diplodocus, stretching out to nearly 30 meters of pure, unadulterated length. Brachiosaurus, the true high-rise of the Jurassic, who held its neck vertically, a biological construction crane reaching for the treetops. The sheer physics of its existence is an affront to common sense. How a creature that tall pumped blood all the way up to its tiny brain without its heart exploding remains a subject of heated debate among people with too much time on their hands. How its legs didn't just shatter into dust under its own monumental weight is another fine mystery. The best guess is a marvel of shoddy, last-minute engineering. Hollow but reinforced bones, a system of ligaments and shock absorbers that somehow, against all odds, held together. Their lives were a monument to gluttony. A sauropod's day was simply one long, uninterrupted meal. But they didn't chew. Chewing is for the ambitious. Instead, all messed down. Inside their cavernous stomachs, a churning cauldron of bacteria and fermentation did the hard work, breaking down. But nature abhors a vacuum, and it despises a free lunch. Where you have a walking mountain of meat, you will inevitably find something that wants to eat it. The predators of the Jurassic were no less impressive in their own brutish way. The most famous of this murderous caste was Allosaurus. Up to 9 meters of muscle and teeth, with poit champion that Tyrannosaurus would later become. But it was lighter, faster, a more agile brand of terror. Scientists, ever the romantics, have found collections of herbivore bones mixed with the remains of Savegic takedown of D, and squabblably true. The idea that they planned it together is a fantasy we tell ourselves to make the past seem less pathetic. They were joined not by strategy, but by the simple, overwhelming stench of free food. And they were not alone. Megalosaurs, ceratosaurs, and a whole host of smaller, scrappier theropods were running around, biding their time, honing their skills. They were the understudies in this grand, violent play, waiting in the wings for their own moment of evolutionary glory. They were wrong about the silence of the past. It wasn't silent at all. The ground was a drum, and the titans played upon it with their steps. Their roars were the only hymns my world had ever known, tearing through the humid air, shaking the giant ferns until footstep faded. But then, a different kind of life began to whisper at the edges of the noise. While the great hunters waged their wars of flesh and bone, a change was taking place among their smaller kin. A subtle shift. I saw it. I smelled it on the wind. Some of them. They stopped growing larger. They began to shrink, to fold in on themselves, becoming denser, faster. Their minds, once blunt instruments of hunger, began to sharpen into points of cunning. And they began to wear the sky. Feathers. At first it was just a strange, soft down along their spines, a mockery of the fur we wore for warmth. It was a blush of color on their throats, a threat display meant for rivals. It wasn't for flight. Not yet. It was for vanity, for warmth, for the brutal theater of their lives. I remember one creature in particular. It haunted the forests that would one day be called Germany, about 150 million years before any human tongue would name that land. It was no bigger than a crow, a shard of night darting through the canopy. It had the wings of a creature born of the air, layered with perfect aerodynamic feathers. But when it opened its beak to cry out, you saw the teeth. Sharp, reptilian, ancient. Its body ended in a long, bony tail, a relic of the earth-shaking lizards it called kin. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a reptile. It was a living contradiction, a scream caught between two worlds. It itself into the void, a frantic, feathered glide from one tree to the next, a controlled fall. And in that fall, I saw the future. I saw that the age of scales was not ending. It was simply learning a new language. They tell me now that the dinosaurs are gone. A great fire, a falling star, a long winter. They point to the bones and call it a closed chapter. But I know better. They never left. They are still here. Their empire just became smaller, faster, and learned to hide in plain sight. Every time I see a sparrow, with its nervous, twitching head and its quick, dark eyes, I see them, the same predatory stillness, the same impossible speed, the legacy of the small, feathered hunters who were once dismissed as nothing. The titans are gone, yes, but their ghosts are everywhere, singing on every branch. During those long ages, while they were learning to fly, my kind was learning to hide. We were the secret ones, the warm-blooded whispers in the dark. We lived in the roots of the world, in burrows that smelled of damp earth and fear. We were small, nocturnal, cautious. Our entire existence was a prayer for the sun to set, and then another prayer for it to rise again before we were found. We ate insects, roots, the fallen fruits they ignored. We raised our young in absolute silence, our hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against our ribs. To be warm-blooded in a cold-blooded world is a special kind of terror. They were giants of muscle and scale, powered by the sun. We were tiny furnaces of flesh and fur, fueled by a constant, desperate search for sustenance. They were the world. We were just borrowing a piece of it, a sliver of the night, hoping not to be noticed. But that constant fear, it made us sharp, it made us resilient. It taught us that to survive, you don't have to be the strongest. You just have to be the one who is still there when the catastrophe comes. And we knew, in our bones, that it was coming. For tens of millions of years, the world belonged to them. They conquered every niche on the land, from the riverbanks to the mountain slopes. They were slow walking fortresses and nimble two-legged nightmares. The Jurassic was their kingdom. But it was not their peak. The world itself was growing restless. The single great continent I was born on began to groan under an impossible strain. It was tearing itself apart. The land shuddered, not from footsteps, but from the planet's own deep, slow agony. The long breakup had begun. This new age, the Cretaceous, would be their masterpiece. It would last for nearly 80 million years, an eternity. The world I knew vanished. As the continents drifted, new oceans were born between them. The planet shattered into a collection of massive islands. South America pulled away, a lonely arc. India began its long, slow collision course with Asia. And this fragmentation created a hothouse of evolution. Life, now isolated on these new continents, exploded into a dizzying array of forms. The world had never seen such diversity, such extravagance, such terrible beauty. The Titans didn't just survive the transition, they flourished. They reached their zenith. The world had never been more full of them, and it had never been closer to being empty. The world decided to fall apart, and in doing so, it became infinitely more interesting. Every chunk of land, now adrift in the vast indifferent ocean, became its own private, poorly supervised evolutionary laboratory. Different climates, different tenants, different rules for survival. This planetary breakup wasn't a tragedy. It was the catalyst for chaos. It's why the Cretaceous period unleashed a menagerie of biological nightmares that mad. And while the ground was literally shifting beneath their feet, a silent coup was underway in the plant kingdom. The old guard, the boring, predictable conifers and ferns, were being overthrown. The insurgents? Flowering plants, angiosperms. They crashed the party in the mid-protective coats. The planet's entire menu was rewritten, and the herbivores, the lumbering, unimaginative bulk of the dinosaur world, had to adapt or die. Some adapted with gusto. Meet the hadrosaurs, the so-called duck-billed dinosaurs. They were the Cretaceous equivalent of a successful startup, medium to large scale, operating in massive herds and equipped with a revolutionary technology, a dental battery. Hundreds of teeth stacked in grinding rows, a pair of living millstones designed to pulverize the tough new vegetation. Some of them sported bizarre, hollow crewry about, probably the quality of the local foliage. Others took a different, more stubborn approach. The ankylosaurs. These weren't animals, they were walking fortifications. Low-slung, covered head to tail in thick, bony armor, and finishing with a bone-shattering punctuation mark to any argument, a massive tail club. They didn't run from predators. They invited them to try their luck and then sent them home limping, assuming they still had functional legs. They were the embodiment of passive aggression turned into a survival strategy. Then you had the show-offs, the ceratopsians, the horned faces. The most famous, of course, being Triceratops, a seen frill protecting its neck, and the powerful body of a bulldozer. They roamed North America in great herds, and it's almost certain those horns weren't just for fending off trouble. They were for starting it. Ritual combat, status displays, settling disputes over mates or prime. While the plant eaters were busy getting more armored, more social, and more ridiculously ornamented, the predators were not exactly idle. They were simplifying, honing their craft. They were becoming the ultimate solution to the problem of too many herbivores. And at the absolute apex of that solution stood one creature, a name that promises violence and over-delivers: Tyrannosaurus rex, the tyrant lizard king. This was not just another predator. This was the final word in terrestrial carnivory, showing up late to the party around 68 million years ago, just in time for the closing act. It was the universe's most perfect killing machine, standing 4 meters at the hip, stretching 13 meters from snout to tail, and weighing in at over 7 tons of bad attitude and biological weaponry. And the jaws. Oh, the jaws. A bite force estimated at 6 tons. Enough to turn a modern car into a crumpled ball of regret. More crushing power than any land animal known to history, before or since. Its teeth weren't the delicate slicing blades of other carnivores. They were thick, conical, serrated railroad spikes designed to puncture, crush, and obliterate. It didn't slice flesh, it exploded bone. It could shatter a triceratops's skull or punch straight through the armor of an ankylosaur. For all its bulk, it wasn't slow. It wasn't a cheetah, but estimates put its top speed around 20 kilometers per hour. For a creature the weight of a city bus, that is terrifyingly fast. You wouldn't outrun it. You would just die tired. And then there were the arms. Comically, famously, uselessly tiny. Science, in its desperate need to make sense of everything, offers theories. They were for holding on to struggling prey, for pushing itself up from the ground, maybe even for courtship. But look at them. Just look at them. Perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps evolution has a sense of humor, a dark, twisted, profoundly ironic sense of humor that would craft the most devastating predator the world has ever seen and give it the arms of a toddler. The ultimate killer with a built-in punchline. We have been told a lie about the monster, a comfortable lie, to make the darkness seem simpler. We imagine a mindless beast, a creature of instinct and rage, driven by nothing more than hunger. But the skull of the tyrant lizard king tells a different story. Inside that fortress of bone was a brain far larger than it had any right to be. And deep within that brain, the regions dedicated to sight and smell were not just developed. They were vast, intricate territories of perception. Its eyes, positioned for binocular vision, were not merely organs of sight. They were instruments of judgment, measuring distance, calculating the precise moment of a final, world-shattering lunge. The olfactory bulb, that deep, primal part of the brain dedicated to the world of scent, was immense, a cathedral built to process the ghost of a single drop of blood on the wind from miles away. This was not some lumbering brute crashing through the jungle. This was an efficient, thinking machine, a design honed to a razor's edge by millions of years of evolutionary pressure, a machine of absolute purpose. And while we picture it as a solitary nightmare, a lonely monarch of a forgotten world, certain bone beds whisper a more terrifying possibility. The skeletons of several young tyrants, found together, suggest a chilling social dynamic. They may have hunted in packs, an organized force. The evidence is scant, a ghost of a theory, but the image it conjures refuses to fade. A coordinated assault by the most powerful predator the Earth has ever known. But the throne was not uncontested. The late Cretaceous was a world of fractured kingdoms, and in other corners of this dark empire, different nightmares held sway. In the sweltering wetlands of what would become North Africa, a different kind of killer stalked the waterways. The Spinosaurus. At up to 15 meters, it was even longer than the tyrant king, yet built with a more slender, almost serpentine grace. Its skull was not the bone-crushing sledgehammer of a T-Rex, but a long, narrow trap, studded, painting the giant fish of the prehistoric rivers. And rising from its back was that bizarre, impossible sail of bone and skin, a structure whose purpose died with its owner. Was it for shedding heat in the oppressive climate? Or was it something more primal, a display of dominance, a dark banner announcing its presence to a world that had every reason to fear it? Yet, beyond these titans of brute force, another kind of predator was emerging, a new breed of killer, lighter, faster, cunning. They are the ones that haunt our cinematic dreams, the assassins of the Mesozoic, the velociraptors, the Deinonychus, the troodons. And here, we must correct the record. The creature that terrorized us on screen, the 6-foot-tall, hyper-intelligent pack hunter from the films, that was not Velociraptor. That was a case of mistaken identity. The monster we thought we knew was, in fact, Deinonychus. Its name is a declaration of intent. It means terrible claw. Living around 115 million years ago, it was a predator built for precision. Roughly 3 meters long, a whiplash tail for perfect balance, and those powerful hind legs, each armed with a specialized weapon. A single, curved, sickle-shaped claw on the second toe, held aloft as it walked, kept pristine and sharp for its singular, bloody purpose. This was not just a hunter. This was a tactician. Fossil sites reveal the unthinkable. The remains of Deinonychus found alongside prey many times their own size. This wasn't a one-on-one confrontation. This was a coordinated attack. They moved with a chilling synchronicity, a pack mind, a silent, shared understanding that turned multiple predators into a single, inescapable net of claws and teeth. This is the true identity of the cinematic raptor, a swift, intelligent, social executioner with the lethal grace of a cat. The true velociraptor was a smaller, but no less fascinating creature. It had feathers. Its bones were thin, almost delicate, a mobile neck, and the same highly developed senses that marked its functions of the future. It was almost a bird with the heart of a wolf. Both of these killers, the terrible claw and the true velociraptor, belong to the same dark family, the dromaeosaurids, a clan of feathered theropods standing on the very evolutionary doorstep of modern birds. Their defining traits were a sophisticated brain, razor-sharp vision, and the capacity for complex social behavior. When we speak the name velociraptor, we are really speaking of an entire philosophy of killing, an evolutionary line that perfected the art of the pack hunt before passing its legacy on. The blueprint for the perfect killer was never erased. It just learned how to fly. The image you hold in your mind, it's a ghost, a caricature drawn from bone and guesswork. You think of a long tail, of teeth, of scales catching a brutal sun. But that wasn't me. That wasn't us. To remember it is to feel the ground shake, not from my own weight, but from the weight of giants. We were not sluggish lizards. We didn't drag our bellies through the dirt, cold and slow. We stood, tall. Our legs were pillars, driving us forward, holding our bodies high above the earth, secret. The simple, brutal secret to our reign. It gave us the power to move, to endure, to run for days without collapsing. It allowed us to carry impossible weight on 4 legs, or to balance with terrifying grace upon just 2. The world was ours because of how we held ourselves. But it was more than just bone and sinew. It was what happened behind the eyes. The world was a tapestry of information, a constant flood. The scent of rain on dry earth from miles away. The subtle shift in the light that meant a predator was moving through the ferns. We had minds that could hold this world, piece it together. The ratio of brain to body in some of us, it was almost the same as the birds you see today. That meant thought. It meant memory. It meant learning from the sting of failure and the sweetness of a successful hunt. We could change. We could adapt. We weren't prisoners of instinct. And we were not cold. There was a furnace inside us, a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the engine of our lives, burning hot and fast, demanding fuel, always demanding more. It's what let us grow to impossible sizes in just a handful of years. It's what fueled the chase, the fight, the long migrations under a sun that would have cooked a lesser creature. We were not waiting for the world to warm us. We brought our own fire to the world. I remember the colors, the impossible greens of the ferns, the sudden, shocking red of a freshly opened flower, or of blood. Our skulls tell you we had large eyes, that the parts of our brain that processed sight were vast and complex. We saw the world in a way you can only imagine. Every shade, every texture, every flicker of movement. And the smells. Oh, the smell of decay was a promised smell, death from over the horizon. And the sounds. Not the shrieks and roars you put in your stories. No. For many of us, it was a sound that came from deep within the chest, amplified through the strange and beautiful crests on our heads. A low, resonant hum that vibrated in your very bones. It wasn't just noise, it was language. It carried for miles through the dense, humid air. It said, "I am here. You are safe. This is our land." It said, "Danger approaches." It was the sound of family. In the nests, I remember the warmth, the delicate, perfect curve of an egg beneath my own body. The instinct wasn't just to lay and leave, it was to protect, to shield them from the sky, from the night, from everything, with my own life if I had to. Fossils show you a mother. Frozen in Time, your series, where dozens of us would raise our hatchlings together, bringing them food, guarding them with a ferocity that could turn back the greatest of hunters. We had bonds. We had hierarchy. We had love. But all that warmth, all that life, it couldn't stop the cold. The catastrophe you speak of, for us, it was the sky falling. A sudden, blinding light, and then darkness. The world that was, it's gone. I am just a whisper now. But the heat inside me, the way I saw the world, the ache of a mother for her young, it didn't all burn away. It was carried forward by the small ones, the quick ones, the ones with feathers. It whispers. It sings from the highest branches now, a memory written in feather and bone. We have this quaint, almost sentimental notion that certain behaviors belong to us. Care, nurturing, teaching the young how to not get eaten 5 minutes after being born. We look at the fossil record and project our own fleeting decency onto these bygone monsters, convincing ourselves participants in a planetary arms race, a brutal, million-year-long demolition derby where the only prize was surviving until sunrise. Their strategies were a masterclass in walking slab of bone and armor with a wrecking ball for a tail. A brilliant idea until something bigger simply flips you over. Others bet everything on speed and sight, a frantic existence of perpetually running from things and toward other, smaller things. The great Tyrannosaurus, the supposed king, was nothing more than a glorified lone wolf, a bully too antisocial to even hunt with friends. Then you had the pack hunters, proving that organized thuggery is a time their chances with whatever horrors lurked in the swamps. A tactical retreat into the water. They tried everything, every conceivable niche, every biological gimmick, and for a while, it worked. They became the undisputed landlords of the terrestrial world, masters of all the dirt and rock they could stomp on. But here's the kicker, the cosmic joke written in stone. While these giants were busy with their terrestrial squabbles, 2 other dynasties were staging their own coups. The real estate above and below was being claimed by creatures that were not dinosaurs, but their close and arguably more ambitious relatives. The sky was the first frontier to fall. The first to truly defy gravity weren't majestic birds, but leathery, flapping nightmares called pterosaurs. They clawed their way into the air back in the Triassic, but it was in the Jurassic and Cretaceous that they truly perfected the art of being terrifying from above. The early models were crude. Think Rhamphorhynchus, a small fry with a long, stiff tail for a rudder and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth snapping ends. Then evolution got cocky. The tails disappeared, the bodies streamlined, and the heads became avant-garde sculptures of bone. They sprouted crests of every bizarre shape older than mammals. Then came the final, ludicrous punchline, Quetzalcoatlus, a creature with a wingspan of 11 meters. Let that sink in. Not a bird, a reptile. A flying, finite wisdom. Still argue about how this biological impossibility even got off the ground. Did it pole vault with its wings? Did it do a four-legged hop? The truth is, we don't know. All we know is that it flew, soaring I'll never reach. And these aerial pirates had diverse palates. Some skimmed the waves for fish. Others were apparently content with fruit. Many hunted smaller animals on the Gruyere. They were running 1,000 different experiments in aerial domination. And to top it all off, many were cove-flying monster can get chilly. It suggests they were warm-blooded, their bodies burning hot with the metabolic fire needed to power such an absurd lifestyle. So, the land was a dinosaur-run battlefield. The sky was pterosaur territory. That left the oceans. While the land dwellers were perfecting murder and the sky dwellers were perfecting flight, a third power rose from the depths. The great marine reptiles. They saw the chaos on the surface and collectively decided, no thank you. They returned to the eternal dark of the sea. Appearing shortly after the Great Dying, the Permian extinction that nearly wiped the slate clean, they rapidly reverse-engineered themselves back into aquatic killing machines. They converged on a familiar design, a sleek body, powerful fins, and a long snout full of teeth. A blueprint for success that dolphins would plagiarize millions of years later. One of the early prototypes was Symbospondylus, a 10-meter beast that wasn't perfectly streamlined but was more than good enough to terrorize the local fish population. But evolution, as always, kept refining the model. Eyes 25 centimeters in diameter, the largest of any vertebrate ever. These weren't windows to the soul. These were biological searchlights, desperately scanning the crushing blackness of the deep ocean for the next meal, or the next thing that wanted to make a meal out of it. It was a deep diver, a creature that lived and hunted in a world of perpetual twilight, relying on its colossal optics to navigate a three-dimensional hunting ground where threats could come from any direction. So there you have it. The world wasn't ruled by one group of titans. It was a planet carved into three warring fiefdoms. The dinosaurs, brutal and powerful, were the kings of the mud. The pterosaurs, bizarre and audacious, were the masters of the wind. And the marine reptiles, sleek and silent, were the emperors of the abyss. Three parallel empires of scale and tooth and claw, each a testament to the fact that life's only real strategy is to find a corner of the world, claim it, and then evolve the most efficient way possible to kill everything in it. While the ichthyosaurs perfected the art of aquatic speed, forging their bodies into living torpedoes, evolution, in its infinite and often bizarre creativity, was already running a parallel experiment. This was the age of the plesiosaurs, creatures that defied our neat categorizations of anatomy. Imagine a biological paradox. The sinuous, impossibly long neck of a serpent grafted onto the broad, flattened body of a colossal sea turtle, propelled by. Their method of locomotion was a masterpiece of underwater engineering. They did not swim so much as fly through the water, each of their 4 limbs beating in a coordinated, rhythmic dance, a technique mirrored today, albeit on a much smaller scale, by penguins and sea turtles. This was a completely different solution to the problem of moving through a dense medium. Where the ichthyosaur was a javelin, the plesiosaur was a 4-oared galley. And some were truly gargantuan. The Elasmosaurus, a titan of the late Cretaceous seas, could stretch to 15 meters. Its neck alone accounted for more than 6 meters of that length, a staggering anatomical investment. For decades, we were baffled. How could such a creature possibly function? The prevailing theory now paints a chilling picture, the plesiosaur as a stealth hunter. It would use the murky depths for cover, its vast body remaining hidden, while that incredible neck snaked forward, a periscope of death, striking at unsuspecting schools of fish or ammonites long before its true bulk was ever perceived. It was a strategy of profound deception. But the reign of these magnificent, strange beasts was not to last. As the Cretaceous period entered its final, dramatic act, the oceans witnessed a violent coup. A new dynasty erupted from the evolutionary crucible, the mosasaurs. They were not relinister, their closest living relatives being the monitor lizards and snakes of today. They were built for pure predatory dominance. A long, muscular, serpentine body tipped with a first of astonishing size. Their tails were flattened into a powerful crescent-shaped fluke, driving them through the water with terrifying force. The largest among them, reaching lengths of 17 meters, were not merely predators. They were the ocean's new tyrants. Unquestioned, unrivaled. They were the ultimate expression of marine predatory power in the Mesozoic. The saga of these sea dragons reveals a fundamental truth. Each environment is a unique evolutionary puzzle. The rules of the land, strong legs, sharp claws, were meaningless here. The ocean demanded new answers to eternal questions: how to breathe, how to see in the blue twilight, how to move without resistance, how to stay warm in the cold abyss. Yet, just as the ocean depths demanded a complete reinvention of the terrestrial form, so too did another equally unforgiving frontier: the poles. We have long been captive to an image of the dinosaur world as a sweltering, global jungle. This is a profound fiction. Some of the most fascinating chapters of their story were written in ice and snow. The Mesozoic Arctic was not the frozen wasteland it is today, but its winters were still brutal, months of perpetual darkness, biting winds, and freezing temperatures. And in this realm of frost, dinosaurs did not merely survive, they thrived. One of the most electrifying discoveries of recent years has been a creature known as Nanuqsaurus, the polar bear lizard. It lived on the northernmost shores of ancient America, in what is now Alaska, some 70 million years ago. It was, in essence, a Tyrannosaurus rex in miniature, a dwarf tyrant. At 6 meters long, it was a fraction of the size of its southern cousin, its skull more compact, its teeth less massive. This was not a sign of weakness, but a brilliant adaptation. In an environment where food was seasonal and scarce, a smaller body, a more modest metabolism, was the key to survival. It is a stunning evolutionary lesson. Sometimes, to conquer a harsh world, you must become smaller, not larger. To reign in this polar kingdom, these dinosaurs evolved a sophisticated survival toolkit. They were almost certainly warm-blooded, generating their own internal heat to endure the long nights, the cold. And crucially, their senses, particularly sight and hearing, must have been exceptionally acute, allowing them to hunt and navigate through the spectral twilight of the polar winter. Herein lies the ultimate revelation. The Mesozoic world was not one monolithic empire of giants. It was a mosaic of distinct, challenging biomes, each crowning its own unique king. The success of a colossal sauropod in a lush floodplain had no bearing on the success of a feathered polar carnivore. The architecture of a leviathan in the sea was irrelevant to the master of the skies. They teach us that dominance is never absolute. It is always contextual. Strength is a measure of adaptation to a specific reality, and it is a humbling reminder that the mightiest creature in one world can be utterly unfit for another, a timeless principle governing the rise and fall of empires, species, and perhaps even ideas. Forget the image you were sold. The lumbering, dim-witted lizards sweating in some primordial swamp, waiting for a volcano to ruin their day. That picture was always a comforting lie, a way for a species that fears the dark to feel superior to the titans who owned the light. The truth is far more impressive and far more insulting to our fragile ego. These were not nature's dullards. We're talking about creatures with a memory palace built for survival. A mind that didn't just register hunger, but mapped entire territories, memorized the seasonal routes of its prey, and logged every shadow, every crack in the rock that could serve as an ambush or an escape. They weren't just living, they were calculating. And they did it in a place we consider the definition of hell, the Arctic. While our ancestors were still figuring out how not to freeze to death by falling into a cold puddle, these supposed relics were thriving in a world of permafrost and twilight that lasted for months. Armored tanks of flesh and bone, ceratopsians and hadrosaurs, not as sun-seeking tourists, but as year-round residents. They didn't just endure the cold, they mastered it. They built nests and laid eggs where the ground itself was locked in a permanent scream, timing their reproduction so their young would hatch into the brief, glorious explosion of a polar net to an evolutionary engine running at peak performance. They were a dynasty that had conquered every climate zone, from the equator's humid embrace to the planet's frozen crown. A biological empire more successful and widespread than anything humanity has ever cobbled together. Which, of course, makes the final chapter of their story not just a mystery, but a cosmic joke with a devastating punchline. If they could beat the Ice Age before it was fashionable, what in the world could possibly get them? Let's rewind the clock. About 70 million years ago. On the surface, it's business as usual. The planet is their playground, and everyone else is just scenery. Dinosaurs are the undisputed landlords of every continent. Pterosaurs still etch their silhouettes against the sky. In the oceans, the mosasaurs reign, leviathans of terrifying efficiency. They are at the absolute zenith of their power, a dynasty without rival. But the rot was already setting in. It began where no one on land could see it, in the deep. The planet's vital signs were becoming erratic, a fever here, a chill there. The great oceans, the cradle of life, were slowly beginning to suffocate. Oxygen levels dipped, and the foundational layer of the marine world, the plankton, began to thin out. It was a silent, creeping famine. The great sea reptiles, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, who had terrorized the depths for millennia, were the first to feel the squeeze. Their food disappeared. Their world was failing them. They were the first major domino to fall in a line that stretched across the globe. This sickness, this systemic fatigue, began to creep ashore. On the continents, the change was more subtle. The dinosaurs were still there, still magnificent, but the vibrant, chaotic tapestry of life was starting to fade. The sheer diversity of species was declining. The genetic library was starting to have missing pages. The planet's very operating system was being updated. Flowering plants, a new and aggressive form of life, were rewriting entire ecosystems, changing the menu for the great herbivores. The world was still loud with life, but it was the sound of a machine running on fumes. The whole biosphere was a string, pulled taut to a note of impossible tension. Still humming, but one wrong touch and it would snap. And the most terrifying part? There was no single catastrophe to blame, no obvious villain. The world was just getting tired. It was becoming fragile. This wasn't a world teetering on the brink of collapse. It was a world that looked stable, that felt permanent to its inhabitants. A world full of life, yet brittle as glass. And that's what makes the end so profound. They weren't brought low because they were weak. They were brought low because the system they mastered had been quietly hollowed out from the inside, leaving a magnificent but empty shell. All it needed was a push. Thousands of years remained, a mere blink in the geological record. The kings of the earth went about their business, oblivious. They had no concept of astronomy. They never looked up. They never saw the cosmos taking aim. It arrived without warning, without sentiment, without mercy. A 6-mile-wide eviction notice, delivered with no appeals process. One moment, a planet dominated by an indestructible dynasty. The next, a footnote in a history book written by apes. Proof that no matter how strong you are, no matter how perfectly you adapt, the universe always has a bigger rock. The sky clenched into a fist and struck a single, precise blow. An impact so profound, its echo has never truly faded. It happened in a place we now call the Yucatan Peninsula, in Mexico. But it was not a peninsula then. It was a tranquil, shallow sea, a world of coral gardens, teeming with tropical life, bathed in an ancient, unfiltered sunlight. Into this paradise the killer fell. Its speed was an almost unimaginable 72,000 kilometers per hour. Its diameter, 10, perhaps 12 kilometers across. The size of a mountain, falling from the heavens. The energy it unleashed was not merely explosive, it was elemental. An equivalent of hundreds of millions of nuclear detonations, all focused on one point in one instant. It did not strike from directly above. The calculations point to a sharp, cruel angle, roughly 60 degrees to the horizon, a trajectory designed for maximum devastation, as if to scar as much of the Earth's surface as it could. The moment of contact was not a splash. It was an act of erasure. The ocean's surface simply vanished, boiled away into nothing. The seabed, the ancient sands, all of it disappeared. Bedrock, tens of kilometers deep, liquefied into a molten sea. In its place, a wound was torn into the planet, a crater 180 kilometers wide and nearly 30 kilometers deep. The Chicxulub crater. It is still there, buried beneath the sediments of millions of years, a hidden testament to the violence of that day. What made this blow uniquely devastating was not just its force, but its location. A terrible coincidence of geology. The ground beneath the Yucatan was saturated with sedimentary rock, limestone, gypsum, materials rich in a hidden poison, sulfur. Upon impact, these rocks didn't just melt, they vaporized, releasing colossal volumes of sulfuric gases into the sky. A chemical weapon delivered on a planetary scale. This aerosol of acid would later fall as a corrosive rain across the entire planet. But the chemistry was a slow death. The immediate effects were far more visceral. A blast wave, a vacuum, hypervelocity winds. A wall of fire scoured the continent. Waves of impossible height slammed into the coasts of the Americas, and hours later, Africa. Rock and dust were thrown clear of the atmosphere, only to rain back down as incandescent meteors across the globe. The light from the impact was brighter than the sun itself. Animals hundreds of kilometers away would have been incinerated, not by flame, but by the sheer intensity of the infrared radiation. The air temperature spiked by hundreds of degrees in mere minutes, enough to boil the moisture from plants, to dry riverbeds, to kill anything without shelter. And then came the opposite, the long night. Dust and soot, ejected into the stratosphere, formed a shroud. The sun was extinguished, a darkness that lasted not for hours but for weeks, perhaps months. And with the dark came the cold. Photosynthesis failed. The great chain of life was severed at its source. Even as the world went dark, the planet itself shuddered in its agony. Seismic waves wrapped around the entire globe, not once, but multiple times. Earthquakes that lasted for days. On the opposite side of the planet, volcanoes stirred. Cliffsides collapsed. The system was broken. This was not a local tragedy. It was a simultaneous assault on the biosphere, the atmosphere, the water, and the very rock of the Earth. To this day, the evidence remains. A scar in the rock. Look closely at the geological strata at the point dated to 66 million years ago, and you will find it. A thin, gray line of clay. And within that clay, a high concentration of iridium, an element rare on the Earth's surface, but common in meteorites. It is the killer's fingerprint, left at the scene of the crime. This thin gray line is the tombstone. It separates the world of the dinosaurs from the world that came after. They used to say it was a slow fading, a gradual chill, a world that simply grew tired and gave us up. They whispered of changing climates, of a world that no longer had room for us. They were wrong. I was there. I remember the sky. It wasn't a sunset. It was a wound. A tear in the fabric of the day, a searing white light that blinded everything. And then, the sound. Not a roar, but the world itself breaking apart. A tremor that didn't come from the ground beneath my feet, but from the very air, from my own bones. We thought the mountain gods were angry. We have no words for a god that fell from the stars. The sun did not rise the next day, or the day after that. The sky, our beautiful, endless blue sky, was gone, replaced by a thick, choking blanket of gray and black, a perpetual twilight that smelled of burning rock and shattered earth. At first we huddled together, waiting for the long night to pass. But the night never ended. It settled into our lungs, a fine dust that made every breath a struggle. The cold came next, a deep, penetrating cold that the thickest hide couldn't keep out, a cold that felt final. The green world I knew bled away. First, the flowers, the bright splashes of color in the undergrowth. They closed their eyes and never opened them again. Then the great ferns, the ones that tasted of rain and sun, they turned brittle and brown, crumbling to dust at a touch. The trees, ancient and stoic, held on the longest. Their leaves withered, turned to skeletons, and rained down in a final, whispering surrender. The world was turning to shades of ash. Without the green there was nothing. I saw the great herds first, the long necks, the titans whose steps once shook the valleys. They moved slower and slower, their massive heads hanging low, searching for sustenance that no longer existed. Their cries were no longer calls of greeting, but low, mournful groans of confusion and despair. One by one, they lay down. Great, still mountains of flesh and bone, monuments to a world of plenty that had vanished in an instant. And when the plant-eaters fell, a new kind of quiet began. The hunters, the sharp-toothed terrors of my youth, they stalked the gray plains with a new desperation in their eyes. I saw one, a tyrant king, his magnificent power reduced to a gaunt frame. He stood over the carcass of a fallen giant, not with the pride of a predator, but with the hollow gaze of one who knows he is eating his last meal. There was nothing left to hunt. They too began to fall, not in battle, but in a silent, lonely surrender to the emptiness. Their formidable roars were replaced by the rasping of labored breaths, and then, nothing. I walked to the great water, the ocean. I remembered a place of life, of crashing waves and teeming shores. Now it was a graveyard. The water itself felt wrong. It carried a sting, a scent of something soured and ancient. The great mosasaurs, those unstoppable leviathans that had ruled the depths for hundreds of thousands of years, were gone. Their immense bodies washed ashore, bloated and strange. The beautiful spiraled shells of the ammonites, creatures that had survived countless ages, Lys 1. I looked to the sky, hoping for a sign, but the sky was as empty as the land. The pterosaurs, the masters of the air, were gone. I remembered their shadows gliding over the plains, wingspans that stretched over 11 meters, their cries echoing from the cliffs. Had they simply starved in the air, with no land left to find, no fish in the poisoned sea? Did they just fall from the black heavens, one by one, into the silent world below? The silence. That was the real killer. The silence was the monster that devoured everything. I would walk for days through skeletal forests and dust-choked plains and hear nothing. No buzz of insects, no chirp of smaller creatures in the brush, no distant call of a rival or a mate, no wind rustling through leaves, because there were no leaves. The only sound was the crunch of my own feet on the brittle ground and the frantic pounding of my own heart in the vast, dead quiet. The world hadn't just died, it had been erased. I don't know how long I kept going, weeks, months? I found pockets of murky water. I chewed on dry roots that tasted of dirt and despair. I saw the last of my kind, ghosts wandering through a landscape of their own demise. We would see each other from a distance, two specks of life in an ocean of death, and we would not call out. There was nothing left to say. We would just turn and walk on, alone. My legs grew weak. The hunger was no longer a fire in my belly, but a dull, heavy stone. I found a small overhang, a shallow cave, and I crawled inside. I curled up, my body trembling from a cold that came from within. I closed my eyes, and I didn't see the gray wasteland. I saw green. I saw sunlight filtering through giant leaves. I smelled the wet earth after a storm. I heard the chorus of a living world, a world that was, a world that would never be again. There is a line in the rock, I know, a thin, dark scar. Below it, our bones, our tracks, our world. Above it, just the dust of our passing out. There are no mass graves to mark their passing, no battlefields piled high with the fallen. Only scattered remains, isolated and accidental. A final, fractured whisper from a civilization of titans that simply ceased to be. An empire spanning 150 million years, dismantled in a single generation. Entire dynasties of life erased. The dominant architects of a planet gone. What survived were the small things, the burrowers, the creatures that lived in the dark, beneath the surface, inheriting a world scrubbed clean by an unseen hand. From these few, these terrified refugees, a new evolutionary chapter would begin. But in that moment, the world was a monument to silence. A planet of ash blanketing the leaves of dying forests, skies without calls, oceans without motion, a throne without an occupant. It was not the end of life itself. It was the end of a specific, magnificent, and terrifying form of life. An end to the Mesozoic. An end to a world no human eye would ever see. For millions of years, the memory vanished. The dust of the cataclysm settled, continents drifted, and new forms of life rose to fill the void. The story was buried, forgotten under miles of rock and the crushing weight of geologic time. It remained a secret the planet kept from itself. Until we began to dig. The 19th century. In England, a new empire of iron and steam began to tear open the earth. Quarries, mines, and railway cuttings sliced through the landscape, exposing layers of time. And from these wounds, the ground began to give up its dead. Unthinkable bones. Fossilized tracks. Relics of a world that defied all known history. The first clues were marine reptiles, the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. But something far grander lay in wait. In 1824, the English anatomist Richard Owen examined a collection of colossal terrestrial fossils. He saw a pattern, a new and terrifying order of animal life. He gave them a name that would echo through time: Dinosauria, the terrible lizards. Names began to surface from the stone: Iguanodon, Megalosaurus. But the truth of their form remained a phantom. When the first reconstructions were attempted in the 1850s for the Crystal Palace exhibition, humanity's imagination filled in the gaps with its own monsters. The Iguanodon, its formidable thumb spike mistaken for a nasal horn, was sculpted into a clumsy reptilian rhinoceros. It stood beside a Megalosaurus, imagined as a bloated, lumbering brute. They were not the agile, dynamic creatures of science, but sluggish, dim-witted behemoths. The first vision of dinosaurs was a projection of our own ignorance. Across the Atlantic, a different story was unfolding. A story of obsession, greed, and discovery on an epic scale. The American West, late 19th century, the Bone Wars. Two men, Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, two brilliant paleontologists, driven by egos as vast as the landscapes they plundered. They waged a bitter, decades-long war for fossil supremacy. They bought ranches, hired private armies of excavators, bribed workers, and spied on each other's digs. In their desperate race to publish first, they destroyed skeletons, misidentified bones, and sometimes dynamited their own quarries just to keep them from the enemy. The result of their conflict was a flood of new knowledge. 136 new species were unearthed: Apatosaurus, Stegosaurus, Triceratops, Allosaurus, Diplodocus. The titans of the American past were dragged into the light, their names born from a feud. They had uncovered an ancient North America, but the central mystery remained. The bones told them what had lived. They offered no clue as to why it had all died. The answer was not in a bone. It was in the dirt. In 1980, the physicist Luis Alvarez and his geologist son Walter were studying rock formations in Italy. They noticed something strange: a dark, thin 76 million years ago, right at the boundary between the age of dinosaurs and the age of mammals. Inside this thin layer, they found a shocking concentration of the element iridium, an element rare on Earth, but abundant in asteroids. The evidence for the planet's greatest assassination was there all along, a faint line in the rock, waiting for someone to ask the right question. What other verdicts, written in the very fabric of the Earth, are we still unable to read. A thin, dark line in the rock, barely a scar, but within it a chemical signature that belongs not to our world. Iridium, an element born in the heart of dying stars, delivered by cosmic messengers. It was the first clue that the end did not crawl forth from the oceans or the jungles. It fell, silent and absolute, from a black sky. Later, a wound was found, a ghost of a crater, 180 kilometers wide, buried beneath the Yucatan Peninsula, Chicxulub. Its age matched the layer of alien dust precisely. The weapon and the wound, a case seemingly closed. But the Earth's body told a more complicated story, a story of a slow sickness before the final, violent blow. The planet was already dying. For thousands of years, great volcanoes had been bleeding poison into the atmosphere, choking the air, turning the oceans to acid. A world on its knees. The strong were already weakened. The weak were already ghosts. The ecosystem was a fragile skeleton, waiting for the slightest pressure to collapse. And then the hammer fell. It wasn't a murder, it was an execution. A final, indifferent act upon a world already condemned. We arrived millions of years later, walking on the ash of that fallen kingdom, and we asked the silent stone what it had seen. It answered not with words, but with bones, with silence, and with that thin, dark line, a geological tombstone proving that even the most powerful dominion can be erased. All that remains is a layer of dust, the final word in their story, and a quiet preface to ours.